Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the latest breakfast session. I'll just get in the camera. Great to see you here on this frosty morning, and hello to everybody who's made it online. Great to see you out there again. This morning we're welcoming Professor Maarten de Laat from the School of Education at University of Wollongong.
Yep.
He's come all the way over to Adelaide to speak to us this morning, so a big welcome to Maarten, and I'll hand over to him. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, yeah, good morning, and also good morning to the remote audience. I hope to interact with you guys as well, but don't mind if I do forget. We have a bit of a technical setup to this morning, so I hope we can get through it. But this morning I would like to talk about network learning, and especially the network learning mechanisms that we need to analyze and make visible in order to understand what are the processes of learning that we are engaging in. And that's a bit of a mouthful, and it's quite a difficult task to do, because in my opinion, a lot of the learning processes that are hidden, we know that learning is happening, but it's very hard to see. So part of the journey that I'm on with my research is to try and identify and develop ways in which we can try and visualize learning processes. Now, the learning itself may be hard to visualize, but there are, of course, lots of activities involved that we can trace, that we can pattern, and that's sort of the focus of the work that I'm doing. And through that, try to develop sort of a deeper understanding of the connections that people are making through learning. So I would like to start this morning with a video. It's a comedy video by a Dutch comedian duo. It's subtitled in Dutch. You can ignore that if you don't want to read Dutch. We put it out on the YouTube, and the YouTube link should be emailed to everybody who's joining us remotely, so you have to press play yourself. But the whole idea here is to try and understand how we deal with change in education and learning. And I think it's just a hilarious, funny video. So let's just have a look at it. So yeah, it's dealing with change, being ill-prepared to transition the change is of course what we see happening in this video, but also you can sort of see that with this whole new pedagogy, which is largely driven, if you like, around the new learning about promoting 21st century skills. It's all about collaboration, communication, creativity, but it's also about making sure that people are taking control of their own learning. And with that, of course, as a teacher, you may feel at loss as well. How do you coach and facilitate that type of learning when students are, chasing more up sort of their own problems and challenges that they're trying to learn around. So it's it's that sort of the transition from you know, that sort of secured, planned, sort of formal education that we used to offer into much more relying on informal learning and people taking actions themselves. It's increasing that sort of agency and developing the thinking skills to start managing your own learning. Now, a lot of that learning, therefore, is built on what I would call the social learning pedagogy. So it's team, communities, networks, and it's all about participation. It's from the community of practice theory, if you like. It's transitioning into co-constructing and problem-solving tasks together, but also it's sort of learning in that sort of real, authentic space where people are trying to solve the problems that matter to them. And as a result of that, it sort of brings that learning into the natural world, if you like, and that opens up for my work also the interest in learning in organizations. So it's more like also like professional development really connects with these kind of pedagogies. So the learning in schools as well as the learning in organizations as well as the learning in the wild have a lot in common all of a sudden. And I think it's very interesting to sort of see how we can develop even connections between these different forms of learning and see how you can bridge, if you like, community learning with school learning as well as, you know, learning via Twitter and whatnot. So the interesting thing is how can we increase participation? How can we increase participating in solving problems together, working on wicked tasks, if you like? But also it's a journey, like we saw in the video as well. It's developing your identity. It's a matter of becoming and trying to project, if you like, yourself into the future to who you would like to be or what you would like to become. And there are multiple versions of all of that as well. But on that journey, it's about trying to see how we can make those rich connections with people out there that are on a similar journey and finding these like-minded people and start co-creating, if you like, solutions for the problems that you encounter together. So with that, in my opinion, it's mostly about developing a rich sort of social network, if you like, in which this learning can take place. And a lot of my work is about uncovering sort of like the potential social networks or connectivities that you can develop along the way. But as you saw in the video, it's dealing with that transition that's really hard, especially in education where, you know, you're kind of, as a teacher, you're sort of planning the learning, the curriculum is all set in stone, it still is in a way, and it's guiding the students through that process is much more different nowadays when you try to encourage them to develop their own ideas and chase their own sort of learning tasks that they would like to set up for themselves. And with that, of course, it's harder to act as a coach or as a companion, as we saw in the video. So you need to try and understand sort of what are people doing, what is the journey that they're on, and trying to find ways to visualize sort of these processes, that is what I would like to focus on a bit more this morning. So an underlying, if you like, theoretical framework that we developed for this, it's sort of capturing that sort of journey. For me, it's about, you know, trying to, in the top part of the circle, you have the word awareness. For me, it starts with awareness, trying to raise awareness around sort of or in the situation that you're in, to sort of identify with other people who are sort of doing similar things, who are on a similar journey, who are, you know, taking an interest in what you're doing. So creating that sort of visibility about what people are working on is a first step to making connections and building sort of learning relationships as you go along. So to me, it's a lot about show participation. That's you know, the participation metaphor is a great thing, but how do we know that we are participating, and are we participating with the right people, and do we have shared and similar interests? So creating that whole idea of participation and demonstrating what people are doing is one way, but you know, we also need to know and make sure that we are working on the same topics. So finding like-minded people is more than just working on participation. You have to know what people are working on. And when we were working in the Netherlands, we were transitioning into sort of what we would say these sort of more open office spaces, a little bit like this. And it's quite nice if you turn up for work and you see other people's screens. You can see, oh, you're working on this. Oh, I just read an article in relation to that. So that's how you start building connection, and you can start facilitating what other people are working on, or you can develop, you know, smaller networks to start working together. So it's participation and creating more transparency about the things that we are working on is hugely important for building those connections. So the top part of the circle in the theoretical framework is all about sort of raising that visibility, raising the awareness, and that can, you know, foster, if you like, action. You can start making connections based on that. So the lower part of the circle then is all about building the culture. So once you have sort of more knowledge and insight in what's happening around you, that doesn't still mean that you are actually developing all these kind of connections. You know, you need to develop trust, you need to have openness, you need to have that sort of reciprocity, if you like, that sort of openness towards each other and start working together. So building that sort of community or network framework around it and cultivating network learning in a way that people are on it with the same journey, if you know what I mean, so that you're not lost in the swamp and you don't know what's happening and you kind of on your own. It's more about, oh yeah, we're here together. Let's see how we can start working together. So developing these community learning or community-based learning principles is very important as well. That needs to be part of either the organizational culture or the teaching philosophy that we play out. And then the next step is to demonstrate the value that we create as a result of it. And to me, learning is a process of value creation. It's about demonstrating what you're working on. It's about telling these stories, but also make sure that you create this value in such a way that you're doing it together. And through that value creation process, you're actually solving problems. And I like the term value creation because it's just broader than just a change in behavior if you define learning in that way. So I think it has a wider interpretation, and it's also easier to apply in different contexts. Because if you study in like informal learning in organizations, you know, in interviews you talk about, so what have you learned yesterday or something like that, and people, oh, nothing. I didn't go to school, or I did not have a training. So the definition or the idea of what learning is quite fixed in the formal sense. And if you start talking about, well, what value have you created, what problems have you solved, and how did it change your thinking as a process or as a result of it, it opens up a much easier conversation to understand learning in those contexts. So basically what I would like to do through this framework is to go from awareness as a starter to then develop engagement. So as we go down, it's sort of promoting that sort of engagement to one another. And on the horizontal, it's about not just sharing information, but creating knowledge as a result of all of this. So that's the kind of direction. And what we're trying to do in the research is to see in which ways we can start raising this awareness and how that then starts to relate to building community processes and fosters knowledge creation. So over the years, I've been developing a mixed method research approach, and it starts by social network analysis, and this is really just simply visualizing the connections that people are having. So in an example here, I'll see if I can bring up the browser for this. It's this one, I believe. I guess everybody can see this also remotely. Is that? Yeah, that's right. So what you're seeing here is a bit of an end result of a prototype that we've been working on. So developing ways of visualizing network learning relationships has been a bit of a journey in its own. We started mapping out on pieces of paper, sort of asking people like, okay, with whom are you talking and what are you talking about and all these kind of things. And then we started thinking, well, would it not be easier if we could develop this into a tool where we can see the results almost straight away? So then we developed what we call the network awareness tool, and we had workshops like similar like this, and everybody would log in and you would just sort of type in all the relationships that you have. But this is the next version. And this one taps directly into like social media, if you like. So this is a result of a plugin that looks into discussion forums in Yammer, but then within a particular organization. So you capture the entire conversation that people are having within the organizational context, even if they have sub-communities and stuff. So you're really cutting across. And the nice thing about this is that you can follow this every day. It's just tapped in a sort of a real life feedback loop. So every time people are sending you messages, the analysis will continue to happen. So basically what you can see here is sort of how people are connected. It's always a little bit difficult. So this is like an ego network of somebody. So you can see all the connections that this person has. And it's an interesting way to see if you can sort of explore how people over time are sort of developing their connectivity and what makes these changes along the way. So if I which screen is it? I'm just lost. This one. Oh no, this one, I guess. Eh? This is one. Yeah. So you can then start to identify sort of people's ego networks, like I just showed, but also like existing networks based on particular conversations that the people are having. And that's not what I want. Too many things to press on here, I think. So the next step in the analysis is to try and relate sort of these connectivity that people have developed with what they are talking about, similar in the theoretical framework. Because if you just look at ties, the relationships that people have, you don't know what they are about. So it's nice to know that people are connected, and if the people in the company are density, you know, so the high density of connections, or if you have students working in groups to sort of see how their group connectivity is developing, but you need to know what they are talking about. So the next step in the multi-method research approach is that sort of content analysis. And in the past, we were using, in the network awareness tool, we were asking people, okay, well, what are your main topics of this moment? And then ask them to say, with whom are you talking in relation to these topics? But with the tool, you can now, of course, make that much more dynamic. So on the right hand, you see this whole tag cloud. And this is applying a bit of machine learning as well, but it's a way of contextualizing and analyzing the dialogue that people are having and condense it into keywords. So then if you click on a particular keyword, you can immediately see which network is connected with that particular topic. So it's a great way of identifying who is actually talking about what in relation to what you're interested in yourself. And you can also click add multiple topics, so you can sort of build up the whole interest, if you like. And what I would like to do is to sort of make this more searchable, so that you can just type in a keyword. But this is still like, you know, this is still analytical states of things. But what I like about it is that it really connects you with sort of, okay, I'm having trouble understanding a particular topic. You can now immediately find people who are also talking about it, if you like, right now, rather than looking in people's profile pages that are maybe 10 years old and never updated and stuff like that. So this is really tapping into, if you like, sort of the daily conversation. If you like, for organizations, they call it sometimes the heartbeat. It's sort of like, okay, what's actually happening in our organization? What are we talking about? And in interviews with managers and also school leaders, when you look at sort of, okay, well, these are the topics of our organization, they really see it as sort of the learning agenda. So because these are really the topics that we're talking about. So basically it's related to work, it's related to the issues that we may have about it, or the interests that we are developing. So you can try and identify not only how people are constructing new knowledge around these topics, but also if that relates to innovation or if it relates to problem solving. And that's the more kind of advanced research that we would like to start developing as a result of this. So now that we know that how people are connected and what they are connected around, so I had a few slides here as well, but I already showed this. We can also then move to the context, sort of, okay, well, what is the culture or what is the contextual environment in which this is actually happening, and what we can further develop as a consequence of these visualizations. So first of all, it's quite nice to sort of see if you can develop more like timeline analysis to sort of see what topics are emerging over time and maybe fading out again, and of course try and understand why that is the case. Are there some critical incidents or something happening, or is this in terms of student learning? You know, if you have mapped out a particular course, you would anticipate them going through particular concepts over time, and you can actually start seeing if that is happening and with whom that's happening and how people are connecting with that. So the timeline analysis sort of shows you concepts emerging, but you can also do that, of course, with the people who are connected with it. So the larger the word is in print, like a tag cloud, the more you are connected with that particular topic. And in terms of trying to make that more dynamic, it's like you can just create this sort of time slice and sort of move it around and try and see, okay, well, who's actually joining in on all of this, and oh, it's actually disappeared. Yeah, so you can, but you can also, of course, see here what people are doing themselves. You can play around with this. And here you have more like the normal stats underneath it, so the more like the bar graph about it. I can't see that in the same. Or maybe if I press so I think you can, yeah, so you can see the bars changing if you like. So it's a great way. So and what I really would like to do is directly connect that tag cloud with this sort of dynamic as a next phase in the research. So to make it searchable. Another way, of course, is that you can start looking at people's activity streams, and especially if you add more content analysis, you can sort of see, okay, well, what contribution do they making to maybe problem solving or knowledge construction? It's sort of, you can identify early adopters of new concepts and stuff like that. So you can really understand sort of, okay, well, what is happening? How are people connecting? And also, are the networks in which people are talking, are the networks themselves connected? Because quite often you will find maybe 3 or 4 different networks that are disconnected, but talking about the same stuff. And that's quite interesting if you're thinking again back in that video about a teacher who doesn't know how to relate to what's happening. You can use these tools to then start bringing students into contact with one another, sort of saying, okay, you've been exploring the same sort of topics. Let's just see if we can bridge these connections and facilitate learning that way, and making sure that people are less on their own. When it comes to the value creation, we developed a theoretical framework to really try to make this more explicit. Again, this goes back to studying communities and networks, and people who facilitate them often try to, have a nice evening or have a morning like this and have a great moment, but it's really hard to tell what actually happens because we don't really have the tools for that and the frameworks that will help us to tell these stories, basically. So rather than just saying, oh, we had a great pizza and we had a great time, we would try and see if we can develop a more richer story that actually helps you to articulate what it was that you were working on, why you were working on it. And this framework helps us in that direction. So basically the blue arrows that go down, they sort of represent the ongoing dialogue. And what we try to do is to sort of split these open, sort of that we have sort of the ground narrative, sort of, okay, what are all the actions and the activities? And on the other side, it's more like the aspirational narrative. What are we trying to achieve? And in between that, we have what we call these cycles of value, that we try to pinpoint the different kinds of values that you get out of these conversations and these aspirational conversations, and try to reflect on, are we actually making progress towards what we would like to try and achieve? So we identified, therefore, like the immediate value, that is having the great evening and the nice pizza and having fun. But the potential value is that you have sort of developed new concepts, or you have developed new contacts, or you maybe got pointed to a particular report that you may want to read. So it's potential value in a way that you've pointed to a particular direction. You haven't really engaged with it yet, but could be promising. So that's great, because that means that you may have got some direction to some new learning, to new sources that you can start to accommodate into your own learning. The applied value is that you try and bring that back to your own practice. So after the meeting and you have read the report or whatever, you say, oh, let's just try this out myself in my own work. Then later on you start to reflect on so, okay, what changes did this make? What kind of value did we realize out of this? And the final one is about reframing value, and it's more like creating a whole new different insight about the things. I'm looking at it from a completely different perspective now. It's not as logical in terms of progression as it is. This is why we call it cycles, but it's quite easy in terms to follow it this way. But as you can see in the graph, you see arrows going everywhere. But what we try and do is to link sort of the objects that come out of all of these cycles with the story that is connected with it. And this is why in the paper we talk about that you create a value creation storytelling genre, basically. And this framework helps you to articulate particular story. And the outcome of it is that it is actually quite easier and more transparent to start sharing what it is that you're doing in your communities. It's easier to communicate maybe to your leaders, to managers, to let them know what the value is of community participation, how this contributes to changes in your work environment or changes in your learning. So basically, this is the way we try and use these kind of mechanisms to reflect more on one hand, raising the awareness, but also developing the ability for networks and communities and teams or whatever to actually learn as a group. So we're not necessarily interested in producing better communities as say. For us, it's more about understanding from a social learning perspective, what kind of elements do you need to add or change, whether it's maybe you need to become a stronger team rather than become more like a network. So the labels itself is not the goal, but it's a way of thinking about how we can facilitate social learning, how we can facilitate learning in groups together. And the appreciation is all about making sure that you share and demonstrate what you are learning and how you are learning and what the results of all of this is. So it's also important for the learners themselves to start demonstrating what they are doing rather than keeping that hidden as well. So it's a way, of course, then also to build further and richer connections with other people out there. So Bieke Sears, a PhD student of mine, applied this framework and the visualizations in a context, in an organization. It was a school organization in the Netherlands. And we were constantly thinking about these informal learning ties, which is the focus of her work, and we were trying to identify, okay, well, what is actually, how do these mechanisms play out when people develop these informal learning ties? And at first we thought that it was quite sort of ad hoc and spontaneous and therefore maybe random, that people just sort of develop these connections as you go along and it's sort of happening by chance. But there were quite a few structures behind it that we hadn't seen before, and even though in the literature it makes sense when you sort of start thinking about it, but it was actually quite nice to see it mapped out in the practice of a real organization, really. So the context is really important, and it's about the hierarchy that's probably already in place of popular people that act as magnets for networks, if you like, because people have either new ideas or they're spontaneous or easy to go along with, so you kind of flock people towards you. But also the location still plays, of course, a very strong part. So if you have an organization that has different sort of departments spread across, then you will, of course, see lots of smaller networks that are within those departments, but between the departments, it's really hard to keep those networks going or alive. So in your visualization, you would not be surprised if you see sort of disconnected networks, but still talking about the same stuff. So that's quite an interesting thing. But also there is a lot of agency, so there's a lot of deliberate action on behalf of the learners or the professionals themselves to start developing and fostering these kind of relationships. And it's needs driven, and it makes sense, of course, because if you're stuck, you need to start talking about stuff. You need to find a way of connecting with other people because you need to solve your problem. But also reciprocity is a real important part of it. So, if you feel there is a connection and people are working with you or thinking with you because you found sort of like-minded people to work with, those ties are much stronger than the ones that you sort of send out and sort of ask a question, maybe you get the occasional answer or not, but that sort of engagement is really important. And homophily is another item that came out really strong, and it has to do with that sort of like-mindedness. People who are thinking or doing the same kind of stuff tend to develop stronger network connections. So it's kind of in connection with the strength of strong ties, or that the people who know each other very well find it easier to keep on developing their connections because they have a lot in common already, they have a shared history, but also they have similar interests. So translating that to learning design, then it's about try to design learning around topics and make these topics really clear and visible so that people can actually find hooks with one another rather than just say, oh, you need to do a group task and figure it out for yourself with whom you're going to work, because that's really difficult, especially in a space where you don't know who's working with whom. But also don't start too big. Just build smaller networks to start with and make use of existing network relationships that are already there, so that you have a culture, if you like, a culture of learning, a culture of connectivity to start from, rather than just hustle everything up and hope for the best. And also, when you can, it may be better not to open up the space too much to start with. So if you rely on distributed networks, then it's really important to really identify people who already have a history in terms of connectivity in place, rather than hoping for that connections will happen through either your LMS or email or Twitter or whatever. That's almost like a bridge too far to start with, if you know what I mean. So stay local and develop from there. Now, some challenges, I've already alluded to a few challenges, but one of the major problems, I think, of this kind of work, it's very exciting, but it's still sort of on a micro scale. It's really hard to make these studies grow. First of all, for like such a plugin to work in an organization, you need to have it installed. You probably need to do some reprogramming to make it fit with the current environment and stuff like that. So it's not flexible, it's not easy, and therefore it's very resource intensive. You're chasing up dollars just to get the tool working rather than for your research. So you kind of feel like the money's going the wrong way, if you know what I mean. And then, of course, if there are new technological updates, your tool doesn't work anymore. So it's constant maintenance, basically. But also the research as a result of it is, I would say, is rather fragmented or small scale. And also it's like, I'm working on this piece of the puzzle, whereas other researchers, somewhere else are doing other things that should be joined up in a way, but it's not, because all these tools are not connected. So that are just a few of the issues that I think we are having, which I think we need to see if we can overcome this in a way that we can start driving, and this is what I would call the new research frontiers. And it's about, if we think that participation, becoming, and collaboration, all these things are so important, we need to start working in a way that we can start integrating what these knowledge practices are all about. So it's about demonstrating what is happening in these practices, but it's also a way to make sure that participation is possible and that we can create a much richer space where people can connect. And I think, and that's sort of in the top corner, it's about linking data, and it's about building scale, but also make sure that we can collaborate and sort of align, if you like, the research agendas that we share. So what we are working on is a plan, and I say we because Sarah Howard, a colleague of mine in Wollongong, we are developing this together as a research application. So we started thinking like, okay, we need to have just a new infrastructure that is skill-free, so people can just join in. And it's a way of starting, therefore, to bring similar data sets, or pick a few variables that are the same and see what sort of data we can bring. And this to me is very important, because when you have all this fragmented research, it also means that you have inbuilt bias of the context in which you are doing your research. So there may be a particular organizational culture, or there may be a particular institutional pedagogy that may inform partly the kind of data that you are collecting. So you're not really transcending, if you like, the context in which you're conducting your research, which to me is limiting if you want to advance the learning sciences in terms of what are the theories behind all these behaviors, basically. So building a framework for connecting and sharing data is really important. But the last point here is we need to have that sort of direct feedback loop into practice. Because if we're analyzing learning, it's based on an ongoing dialogue, if you like. It's interactive. So the visualizations that you put in place will have an impact in practice immediately. So you need to understand, therefore, what's happening afterwards. So the feedback loop of the data and the visualizations that you are developing needs to be on a real-time, or like a near real-time at least, basis. So what we are thinking of is moving into the cloud, because that's what you need to do. And the advantage of moving your research into the cloud is that it connects, if you like, the storage of data with the ability to do high power analytics. Because a lot of the AI or learning analytics is taking place in the cloud already, especially if you start dealing with larger numbers. And for universities, this is not, I mean, some are further than others, but A lot of universities still have sort of a campus-based storage mentality when it comes to data. So getting access to data is already really hard, let alone trying to move it into the cloud for allowing this type of analysis to happen. So the difficulty here is to try and understand sort of where we are at and how we can sort of develop a culture that's more driven by a cloud-based philosophy. And what we found is that it's really important to start developing public-private partnerships. And by public, I mean, we are the educational institutions or organizations that just want to advance sort of the research in the learning sciences. But the private partners can just as well be like the technology industry who develop these clouds, who develop AI on a daily basis. They have a very strong force behind them that we can tap into, that we can leverage and use that to start developing our research. And to me, the advantage of that is that you develop what I would call here the data trust. Because rather than just using or buying an AI engine off the shelf, you don't really know what the algorithms are doing behind it. There's not a lot of knowledge or shared information around it. It just simply works. But you don't know if it works for your context. So by having these partnerships and starting working together in the cloud, you can actually start publishing sort of around the research that you're doing. So the algorithms become more transparent. It's more part of critique and scientific discourse that is, I think, much needed. So part of the idea is to create in the cloud what we would call a data lake. And I'm starting to think more about the term like a data commons, but there are a few strings attached to that. But by creating a data lake, the idea is that the institutions will bring their data, or at least the selected data. I'm not saying that you need to put all your data into the cloud, especially not if you're there in your philosophy, but the idea is that if you bring at least the data that you need for particular research projects into the cloud and start bringing in the same data or similar data from different institutions, you can start developing shared research projects and start adding and linking data into larger volumes. And as a consequence, you can then start the outcomes of the models that you are building, they can then go directly back into the institutions. So it's within the data lake, you can start developing many different projects for different needs, but the institutions that are part of the cloud can sort of say, oh, this model, that fits with what I would like to do in this one. So you can pick the models that suit your agenda and have them going back into the analysis of learning and facilitation of learning on the fly, basically, because within the cloud, you can start developing that data feedback loop much easier than stepping out into the cloud, going back into local storage and processing and things like that. So it's just a way of thinking about scaling up. So as these ideas developed, we applied for an ARC LEAF grant. We're still anticipating outcomes, so we're not quite sure where we are yet. But the idea is that we are working on data trust and data governance models, because the governance of data, of course, is a huge question, as well as how can we build that data feedback loop. It's a bit messy, this slide, I see. But part of the idea is building this infrastructure will allow us to work on these three aims. So it's not that something that needs to be in place, but it's part of the 2-year project, if you like. So how can we actually make this work? And how can we therefore start using this direct feedback loop to analyze learning in real time, in practice, as well as, on the other hand, scaling up and starting using data from multiple sources to really start advancing our theory as well as model developments. And what I like about it as well is that, where I'm working on sort of raising this awareness, somebody else may be doing lots of work on discourse analysis. But if you can join the two together, because they're already available in the cloud as AI models, you can kind of start stringing things together and therefore bring the richness of our collaborative research into the daily practice of education or in the learning sciences. So it's a huge project, at least as an application, because we don't know yet if it's, but we've been working on it also with Shane Dawson, UniSA, Monash, Deakin, UQ, USITS, as well as Google and Deloitte. And Google, of course, is the whole Google Cloud platform. And Deloitte is a very trusted partner in developing sort of these data pipeline, how to ingress the data, the data foundation. So I hope we're in a strong position, but that's kind of where we are going at the moment. So that was my last slide. Yeah.
Okay, so there's one question up there. If you could wait for the mic before we ask you a question, that'd be good. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you for an absolutely brilliant presentation. You ticked so many boxes that some of them didn't even exist. I loved your, first of all, I need to say that I lecture in financial management, so I loved your opening video there, what's 2 plus 2, and my answer is whatever you would like it to be. Now, that leads me to your model. We're trying to teach critical thinking and teach the students how to take their knowledge and apply it to the business world, and that's where my question's going to come from. Two key things that you talked about. One was context, and the other one's just quickly left my mind. But if I take where you are coming from, my question's going to be, have you looked at undergraduates versus graduates versus application in the real business world? And I'm not saying that academia is not the real business world, you know what I mean, the widget world. Have you looked at those three issues? And the one thing your model doesn't mention is risk. Let me take your final point to elaborate on what I mean by risk. You take the spiritual nirvana of the beauty of academia and you link it with Google. Google are going to be looking at that beautiful spiritual nirvana that's going to make money as opposed to where you want it to go. That's what I mean by risk.
Yeah. Yeah, I mentioned, well, I didn't mention it, but it was on the slide, ethics. And part of risk is ethics. You know, we need to really define, of course, what are the ethical context in which this can take place and what are the rules and sort of workflow processes that are associated with all of this. So to me, that's sort of nested in that area. And I think also in terms of working with industry, you will have, of course, all these contracts in place that make sure that these things are ethically bound in a way. But also, not everything that Google does is out in the open, if you know what I mean. So if you enter into more like a, you know, it's a difference from using Google or Gmail for free or, you know, go into an enterprise relationship with them, because then everything is just behind the, you know, in the vault, if you like. So you don't need to worry too much about it. But it's just these conversations that need to happen. We need to know what are the risks involved and how can we make those risks more transparent and make it part of the dialogue. And this is part of, if you take this conversation a bit further in terms of the changes that are coming with AI in education, it feels at the moment that education are not part of this dialogue, or at least not enough. So you can adopt AI in education, but you're not behind the steering wheel of what it does and how it should work. And that to me is a big problem. So rather than just taking, if you like, off-the-shelf algorithms, we need to make sure that we develop the algorithms that suit and are embedded in needs and problems that come from education. So that should be the starting point of the development of the AI applications that we want to apply in education, rather than do it the other way around and people, you know, saying this is the right tool for you, but you don't really know how it works, and you will never know because that's part of the business secrets, if you like. So risk has many aspects of it, and I think part of this, well, part of the whole application is to see how we can unpack all of that and put the right security boundaries in place to make sure that we can make this happen. But also take advantage of what the private sector actually does in terms of developing power and stuff like that. Because again, you know, you can embed some AI in your own tools, but it outdates, or you need to keep on working with it. Whereas, you know, in Google, there's a super large team working on developing AI, and they develop all kinds of toolkits that you can start working with. Intel does the same. You know, there's a lot out there that we're not really using, and we're not really using it in a way that we connect them with what are our real problems and how can we start solving them with these kind of toolkits. So I see it more as this is why it's a partnership. You know, you have a shared responsibility and a shared commitment to making this work, but it needs to be well articulated, it needs to be open, it needs to be critiquable, if you like, and that to me starts adding to all these issues of trust and well, risk is an aspect of that, I would say.
We've got a question from Stephen Clark online. Can students access these tools? Are they usable for their learning?
At the moment, it's a prototype. So again, this is, you're kind of hitting a wall somewhere, you know, and that's doing research is nice because you can work with prototypes and you can sort of, but that to make it work in the real context, you need that extra development, you need that extra step, but that's actually quite a big step. And getting, you know, either you need to have a startup or something because it's very hard to get sort of the funding to start keeping up and developing all of this. So the answer is no, in a way. It's not a workable model in a way that you can, but the research is out there, so you know, you can replicate it if you like. And there are already tools out there that support some of this almost, well, for free as well. I think there are a few social network tools where you can actually start visualizing networks and add sort of like the context or like the epistemic layer into it. So I'll have a look at sort of which tools there are that sort of work in this spirit.
Thanks. Any more questions in the room? I was wondering if you could take us back to that circular. It looked fantastic, but I'm sure it was more meaningful than that. But there was it was interesting. There was a thickness to the lines.
Oh right.
No,
so this one, but then the other. One. This one, or
yeah, that's the one. Could you take us through that one a little bit more?
So the thickness is sort of a representation of how many connections there are, and if it's an outgoing or an incoming connection. And it's kind of the same, well, it's a common thing in social network analysis because there are many different ways you can sort of enhance the visualizations of all of these network connectivity. So if you look at the thickness of the arrow or the line, it's often an indicator for the strength or the intensity of the connection. And it can be either two ways or it can be cumulative. So if we have many connections, it could just be a thick line between us, or if I send many questions to you, it's a thick line from me to you, basically. But if you don't reply, so you can sort of show that interaction. But you can also do different ways, you know, you sort of this in and out degree, as it's called. You can use that also to enlarge, if you like, the node in the network. That's oh, can I just go back? No. It's the, so here as well, here you see the lines and the blue dots are the people, those are the nodes that are connected by the lines. But what you can do is if somebody receives many connections from different people, you can make those nodes, you can visualize these nodes larger based on how many they actually receive. So these visualizations can really help you understand sort of what's happening and facilitate sort of the reading you can take from these visualizations. But using that alone is already, and that's often a problem also with visualizations turned into dashboards and things like that. The ability to read these kind of visualizations requires quite a lot of insight or training or professional development. So it's not just a way of creating, if you like, that sort of feedback loop and then sort of like, oh, here, now you have it. It's thinking about, okay, well, how does that then connect with the pedagogy that you have in mind or in place? And I like that idea of mapping, if you like, sort of the planned course with the actual course through the observation of how people engage with it, sort of what were the interactions that were happening, were they happening when we thought they were or not, do we need to change something in the design? And how these visualizations can be used by teachers as well as students or, you know, people in organizations.
Thanks very much.
I think there's another.
Okay, we have another question.
Thanks, Maarten, for the presentation. So just building up what you just said about how would students be able to use any visualization like that, given the amount of, ability to interpret and data literacy to understand. Like if I'm a student and I'm shown one of these, is it good? Is it bad? I don't know. I mean, what would they do with it? That's is there a way of maybe having, I don't know, hints or suggestions out of it, or something actionable, right?
Yeah. Well, I think there are two ways of doing it. Especially with applying more AI into it, you can start, in terms of hints, I'm thinking recommendations. So you can sort of guide people through sort of what the visualizations may mean by providing hints. You can also, of course, through direct human intervention, have a conversation about it. Sort of, okay, well, this is what we're seeing, this is what it means. And some of the research in this area also indicates that these visualizations should be used as a way of raising the idea that you may need help. But what the help is then, of course, the next question. And at Wollongong, what we started doing is to develop research sprints, where we work with teachers to help sort of interpret the visualizations and what it means in order to develop manuals or ways of working with these kind of feedback in order to improve the teaching and learning. So it's like I was just saying, you can't just give it and sort of hope for the best. You need to think about the whole pedagogy and the guidance and the structures that need to be in place, whether it's through descriptors, it's through hints, or a combination of all of that. But also we need to follow up this with studies to sort of see, okay, well, what is the impact of the visualizations? How does it change learning? So like that's what I mean by it's an ongoing dialogue, and whether it's human or AI hints or interventions that try to put people on the right course, if you like, we still need to understand if that's really happening and whether or not we need to adjust the visualizations or the tasks or the activity that people are engaged with.
Thanks. We've got a question from Gabriel online. Excuse me. Is this the future of making our teaching, coaching, learning work visible and measurable and therefore controllable?
Well, I wouldn't say controllable. It's which way you want to take this. I think it's for us as research. It's a great way of uncovering what's really happening. And I think from a teaching point of view, it's a great way of connecting with the students in terms of what they are trying to achieve and how you can guide that process forward. So rather than saying control, because control means that you already know what the end game is and that you've designed and planned your learning in such a way that you know from today till tomorrow till the day after, this is what you need to do and this is where we are going. I would like to open up this space and allow for much more creativity, but find ways to keep in touch and stay in tune with the activities that are going on to help guiding that sort of learning process. So it's more like facilitated discovery rather than controlling in a way like, okay, well, this can be done automated, that can be done automated, so we don't need this anymore, so let's just move on or something like that.
Okay, thanks for that. Are there any more? There's one last question and we'll run out of time. Thanks.
Thank you. Actually, it's the first question I asked. The part that I wanted to address, because it's within your realms of control, was how does the model work for undergraduates and postgraduates? I would imagine the model would give you a very different view of the world. Have you done that, and what did it show you?
No, I haven't done it yet. Most of my work has been done in organizations and teacher professional development. So that's where I've been. Maybe Shane, you have done lots of social network analysis. Maybe you can say something about this.
You've got it. I'll talk after.
Okay. But in terms of maybe another work that's interesting in this context is from Bart Rienties. He does quite some exciting work in learning analytics, where he tries to understand sort of, okay, well, how do students go through the course? And he has applied that, I think, in both contexts and try to understand sort of the mapping of student engagement and the pedagogy and the teaching activities and the learning activities that are in place, but compare sort of with what we see is happening with what we hoped for that would happen, sort of what we intended to happen. And I think that analysis is really crucial for reflection on improving teaching design or learning design, or trying to understand how students are actually improving when they are going through their course, and at which moment they may need additional support or help.
Thank you very much, Maarten. If we could show our appreciation for Professor Maarten de Laat. Thank you very much. And thanks everybody for coming, and thanks to everybody online, and we'll see you next month. Thank you very much.